Okay, our third speaker is Juliana Forero. Juliana is a program specialist for research at the at WHITRAP, the World Heritage Institute of Training and Research for the Asia and Pacific region. And she's an anthropologist with a Ph.D. in urban studies from Huazhong. Oh, now you've got the light coming right through the back of the paper. Okay. Huazhong, University of Science and Technology in China, and a master in social anthropology from Universidad de Los Andes in Colombia. And her presentation is addressing the importance of the improvement of quality of life and well-being, as well as acknowledgement of cultural practices of local communities where cultural heritage conservation takes place. And I think you're going to talk essentially about social sustainability and heritage conservation. So, Juliana. Thank you.
Hello. Some of you already know a little bit this subject. I was working with it since a few years ago. What I'm going to present today is more or less a discussion on how sustainability, social, cultural sustainability, and heritage conservation brings to something that in Latin America it's worked a lot and not very international, but it's something that I tried to rescue in this research, and it's the social function of cultural heritage. So what I'm going to present is a little bit the framework of sociocultural sustainability and heritage conservation, to then understand what does it mean social function of cultural heritage, and then I will give a little some examples of Latin American experiences on this approach. The Latin American experiences are not in the book. This is undergoing, but this is. Okay, I always bring this quotation because this comes from 1995 in Asia, in an Asia Society meeting in Thailand, where they basically tried to, they were proposed, they had the development, the people, and the conservation processes should be linked. And it was 15 years ago now, and it was something that was starting at the same time that here in Europe they were starting to talk about integrated conservation. And it was something that Asia was trying to ask for because the development patterns that Asia could follow were not the same patterns that they could follow in Europe. And somehow the same thing was going on in South America, Latin America, let's say. So a little bit of the background of this subject nowadays, we talked about it yesterday, so I'm going to do it very fast. There are development changes, the paradigm of development is changing a lot, and it's also changing the focus, the areas in the world. So now we're not talking about anymore only Europe and United States, but we have the BRICS, you have Indonesia, we have Korea and South Korea, we have Latin America as well. And it has created a reorganization of the population between what is called Global South and Global North. It means now the cultural leaders for development are more or less growing more in the Global South. Global South, it's Asia, Latin America, and Africa mainly. And as we can see in this graphic, I like it a lot, it's a quotation from Tim Winter. We can see how the population is decreasing in the Global North and is increasing in the Global South. It also brings some urbanization processes where the population is going to be more in the developing countries, not in the developed countries. And linked to conservation and heritage concept, it brings two important things. One, the heritage concept, it's changing, and we saw it, Giovanni talked very clear about it, where the borders of this concept and how to understand it and the time we give to it and the ideas and also like the processes of identification, they have changed. It goes as well with some changes in the charters and recommendations and declarations in the last year. The last, let's say, one of the ones that really try to approach this, it's a historic urban landscape. Also, we talked about it yesterday. And there is something that is not really mentioned as such, is the social function of heritage, and this is what I'm going to talk about today. Why? Because combining all of this, then we have UN Habitat 2016, where basically heritage and culture are going to be officially introduced in the new Millennium Goals. And so, okay, let's talk about sustainable development a little bit. That from there is coming the sociocultural sustainability. Development, when the question about sustainable development started, it was somehow in the global north, it became from economic and environmental approaches. The technology and the financial resources here were much more to, let's try to think about in the future in terms of economic sustainable strategies and the management of the environment. But in the global south, there were no resources, maybe many times no technology, and many times lots of cultural and social expressions. So these were somehow the tools, like in the Global South, work for their proposals for sustainable development. And I bring this map. This map, it's normally how you see the world in China. This is, it was really different for me when I came to China and I saw this, because we see in the center of the world, we don't have Europe, we have other countries what we don't even distinguish many times. We know there is China, Asia, but there are other small countries in Asia that we don't even acknowledge, recognize, or we don't even know what is it about. So in these small areas, like, is the red one for the light? Oh, yeah. In these small things you see here, it's our island where we are like, oh yeah, what's the name of this country? What's the capital of this? In these places, they had lots of communities, people living, people creating, people proposing, but with not enough economic resources to create, let's say, more other kind of economic and environmental tools for development. And then it's when we have somehow cultural heritage as a tool for development. Before it was somehow recognized in the official discourses for development, and it's called social function of heritage. So basically, talking a little bit about the concepts we're talking here about, then we have social-cultural sustainability, where I think is not, it's very fast what I'm going to say. We have cultural knowledge and also some boundaries and social limitations of the uses of this cultural knowledge, which are interrelated with the space in terms of social relationships, social structures, culture, and all these transparent connections between people and expressions, cultural expressions that take place in the specific spaces. Then we have, when we talk about community and when we talk about people, because there are other components, but in sociocultural sustainability, when we talk about people, there are like three main categories to analyze, which are community, neighborhood, and sociocultural capital. When we talk about community, basically sustainable communities, community cultural development. When we talk about neighborhood, it's the relationship between lifestyle and urban spaces. And when we talk about sociocultural capital, we're talking about the characteristics among neighborhoods. When we're in a city, for example, we talk about the material and immaterial bounds of the culture, and we talk about memory, identity, and territory. And here I stop a little bit with territory, because when I'm talking about territory, I'm not talking about the space. I'm talking about the recreation and the reconceptualization of the space after relationships happened in the space, after the space is intervened, and it's not necessarily a landscape. So the relationship between sociocultural sustainability and urban cultural, it says cultural heritage, it's basically, they have one main object, is the people, is their quality of life, the well-being. It's also to enhance the cultural values, to acknowledge these cultural values. And the principles are the relationship between community and territory, and also to create development processes where social and cultural values are acknowledged and are also enhanced. In this framework, then how we do integrate, and this comes a little bit of a debate we were having when I was starting this research. We were working with other two people as well, trying to understand how to think about conservation, social sustainability, but also how to think about public participation processes in Chinese way. I did this research in China, so how do we do that? And then we have cultural values, quality of life, and well-being, trying to acknowledge the cultural aspects, the social aspects, but also the interrelation between both of them. So we have relationships, we have cultural practices, like lifestyle, but we also have, besides of the cultural values and the well-being, we have the quality of life, which integrates inclusivity, equity, and confidence, and these things somehow were the basis for us to try to have some parameters to understand what we were doing when we were trying to apply this approach in the south of China and also in Inner Mongolia in China, because it was complex for the planners and for the practitioners to think about this sociocultural sustainability in terms of development of conservation and development in the field. And then we have community and neighborhood as, let's say, the lenses for all of these categories. So when we talk about social function of heritage, we have one main object, which is community, and it's interrelated with the social dynamics and the perception of the space of the community. So we talk about past, present, and future, and it's not. I have no dates here. I'm not talking about the past 1 century ago, 3 centuries ago, or yesterday. I'm not talking about present. Also depends in which present and where are we talking about, which is the context and which are the development dynamics and the speed in each place for us to understand what it means present and future. And we're talking about identity, memory, and territory. We're talking about objects, places, but also practices. And material and immaterial expressions, which here are like, let's say, divided, but these are only one thing. And then it's when the social function of heritage, it's based in 3 main elements. One is the definition of informal and formal heritage. Normally we work with the formal heritage, the one listed, the one recognized in local level, regional level, national level, international level. But normally the informal heritage, which is sometimes the informal economy we see on the streets, when we see minorities, indigenous living on the streets, this is also part of informal heritage, but it's really difficult to approach the conservation and also to integrate these dynamics in development processes when are not officially acknowledged. So this is a whole debate about who is defining what is cultural heritage. Then we have the material and immaterial, which in Latin America and in Asia as well, it's really, I'm sorry, I don't quote Africa because I don't really know the subject, but I assume it could be the same. When we were working in identification processes or nomination dossiers for the World Heritage Center, to divide material and immaterial, it was really difficult. Because when you go to the community and you ask for these things, it's like, it's body and soul, they go together. So somehow we started to work with the spirit of the place concept. It has changed a little bit, but let's say this is somehow could bring together these 2 elements. And then we have the heritage practices and cultural rights. What does it mean? It means the heritage and the cultural expressions are also part of the rights the communities they have, not only to acknowledge and make visible that they have this or this kind of identity or this other kind of identity, but it goes also through peace processes for social cohesion. It goes also through the acknowledgement of diversity. And so this is like the framework, but in Latin America, after seeing this, in Latin America we have, when we talk about heritage and conservation, this is very brief, but there are some issues with the development models that they go always related to social problematics, to cultural diversity. We cannot talk about development just thinking about improving something, but we have to deal with unequal and unfair social situations. We have to deal with communities that we cannot bring together. We have to think about lots of populations. So what happened during the last centuries is that the development model became unequal and expansive growth. It means that the cities were planned in some places, in other places they were not planned. I don't know if I'm taking too much time.
We're getting close to the end.
Okay, yeah, very close. But what happened there is like we have areas where are very well planned, but there are areas which are totally abandoned, which were built by the people themselves, and then the historic centers in these processes, and mainly during the last century, the historic centers and the historic areas were abandoned by the governments or were abandoned by different processes because of different reasons, and then the poverty and lots of social and complexities of the society in Latin America, they started to be living in the historic areas. Many of them formally acknowledged, many of them just neighborhoods that are very important in the history of the cities, but they are not acknowledged. So we have two, let's say, two spatial relationships. One is really with good quality of life, very well planned, and then we have other kind of areas which are characterized by exclusion, marginalization, lack of equipment. So, and then we also have a multicultural society in the cities. We have the universal citizens, let's say, but we have indigenous coming, we have farmers coming, we have gypsies coming, we have black minorities coming, we have young people mixing all of this with whom cannot find other way of living more than going into crime and all these kind of things. So we have also social and economic problematic. It brings two things together, different communities with different values, memory and identity, but we also have urban poverty, social conflict, inequality, and we have to deal with this, with populations that are thinking and they see the world different, and as well, they are all in the same confronting the same problematics. And in the historic areas, it isolated the historic areas from the development process of the city. So sometimes in Latin America, you can see the historic centers are here, and the development is here, and the quality of life is planned here, and the center is abandoned because nobody knows what to do with it. I mean, nobody can deal with it. We have problems, international campaigns, everything, and there are some cases where the thing changed, and this is what I'm going to change a little bit, because this isolation of the historic areas created lots of urban management and financial and legal aspects, problems in these levels first, that the governments, they didn't know how to approach that. So I'm going to talk in general in Latin America. There are some strategies and lines of action to approach this problematic. So in terms of strategies, many of them, they took the cultural dimensions and they included in the development plan. So let's say they started to think which is our cultural and which is the population we have here. And it's mainly characterized by the cultural diversity that they understood now the territory as cultural territory. Then they have management plans where they have to necessarily try to bring people together and acknowledge the different identities in the city. Then they have the community rights, and then they start to think about rehabbing historic centers or historic areas, but also necessarily linked to rehab depressed areas in the city. And then we have the involvement of the community in this process, which is not only consultation, but many times it's empowerment of the people. It's to give them the tools and somehow tell them the right and the responsibility they also have for this process. So here we have, I have two cases, but we have more in Chile and in Uruguay. They have the neighborhood counselors, which is like in each neighborhood they have groups of people working together, and they are not only checking what's going on with the conservation processes in the city, or how the urban planning management is establishing some rules, but they are also involved in these processes. From the meeting with the community to tell, yeah, we should do this, we want this, to go actually and paint the houses with specialists. So we have, for example, combining specialists, local governments, and people going to restore the sites, and it somehow makes them to feel they belong to this place, and also to take care of that and get empowered in this area. And in Colombia, for example, Bogota has a cultural system which has a small congress, let's say, composed by the different populations in the city. And there is no decision in terms of cultural development, in terms of cultural policies that is not approved by this group of minorities and populations. And there is also something called Workshop School. What they did, it was they took these immaterial expressions they have in the culture, let's say, and they also took some techniques to work on heritage sites. So, for example, to work with wood, but not for any table, but for the wood that is in the churches that we need to restore. So they started to train people who had no access to education, who were coming from very poor neighborhoods, that they had not opportunities, let's say, to have like a formal way of life and a way with quality of life out of the crime to get money, because they had no education and they come from many problematic situations. And they were trained as professionals to work on restoration processes in different things, to work with metal, to work with wood, to cook, to teach this kind of dances, to teach this kind of history in specific places. It was first in Bogota. Now it's in 5 cities in the country. And these people are ensured to then have a job in a specific field, but in a specific field where they somehow, when you work with communities, that they also improve their self-esteem, and they also feel they could belong to their own place and they could help to improve the heritage in their own area, because let's say the ones from Bogota work in Bogota and in the center of the country, but then we have in the Caribbean these things. It brought somehow lots of things that they became leaders in their communities. So it brought also something similar to the neighborhood councilors in different regions in the country. And it also became one of the sustainable processes, because they were also, after finishing, let's say, the capacitation processes, they created small restaurants, auto-sustainables, working in cooperative ways. So they took all these cultural resources to work together and to create auto-sustainable and, in terms of economic terms, processes out of heritage expressions. Okay. And then we have these lines of actions, which are very quickly, it's like the urban policies integrating participation, then we have the renewal needs, and then it's important here, it's how they, based on this approach, they took the informal commerce, the social housing, and the cooperative business here in this part. It was also something the governments did to try to improve the quality of life of the people in historic areas, but acknowledging their conditions and integrating them in the system. And then these are like quick experiences. This is one park in Bogota. It's a park which the indigenous in the north of the city, they were living before there. Then after the colonization, they had to move to the borders of the city. And when the city took this part of the park as part of the urban area, it was a quarrel for a long time. Then in 1995 and then 2005, they decided to take back this space and work in the design with the indigenous who live in the border of the park, and it became like a space for indigenous in the city to meet together, but also to like a space in the city to make conciliation processes between different communities when they have conflicts. Here is where they meet. In Cuenca, they have a very interesting process now applying HUL, where they are somehow trying to make a sustainable approach, not only in the historic center, which is listed, but also, yesterday I was told they decided to adopt this approach for the whole city in the official management plan and development plan of the city for the next 10 years. So it's somehow involving the community all the time, and this process, the main achievement, I think, it's they achieved to bring community, government together, and for them to believe each other, because at the beginning community, they didn't want to believe the government could do something, so now it's... And then this is in Costa Rica, in San Jose, is the middle school. It's a building they brought in 1892 from Belgium, and it's a building which is very particular, but now it's a school. It's a school for children. It's for free education for 10,000 children go there, and it's a space they have defended a lot. Like, it's the only building in San Jose they took out of building for the offices or for rich people, and they gave it to public service. So it's an example. And yeah, I'm going to. Sorry. Yeah, no.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
That's
yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry to. That's awful to do that to anybody, and it's so interesting.
No. I know.
Other speakers, and thank you very much.
Thank you.